A printed list worn at the edges circulates like an urban relic. Dozens of names, dates, short notes, each one placed by implication within the orbit of a single political family. Headline clippings flash across the screen in memory. Sudden deaths, tragic accidents, suicides, and unsolved cases stitched together into a single narrative. For decades, it has been passed from inbox to forum thread, from late-night radio caller to viral social post. The phrase attached to it is blunt and deliberate. The Clinton body count. Coincidence, or something more? We begin with a promise. This film is an examination, not an indictment. We will take that list seriously enough to read it, with the care that real lives deserve, and with the skepticism demanded by responsible inquiry. Every name we discuss will be labeled: allegation, reported fact, official ruling. We will point to the documents and reporting that form the public record. Where the record is thin, we will say so plainly. Where the record is strong, we will let it speak. And wherever possible, we will show the files, police reports, coroner findings, investigative journalism, so that the viewer can trace our steps. A note on ethics before we begin. These are real people, often with grieving families. Repeating rumors without qualification causes harm. Naming someone in an allegation can have consequences that outlast any viral post. This investigation is structured to illuminate how claims form and spread, and to weigh evidence with care. It is not a vehicle for rumor. We will treat proof as the standard, not accusation as the temptation. How this investigation works. First, inclusion criteria. For a death to be considered in this examination, there must be a documented, credible public link, professional, social, or political, between the deceased and the Clinton sphere. We do not include peripheral or purely speculative links. We avoid repeating names that appear only on anonymous message boards. We also avoid aggregating long lists of uncontextualized names. That format contributes to myth-making. Instead, we drill into a handful of representative cases, each one selected because it appears frequently in the list, because the public record is substantial enough to evaluate, and because the circumstances raise genuine questions that can be checked against official records and high-quality reporting. Second, sourcing hierarchy. Our first preference is for primary documents, official police reports, autopsy and coroner findings, court filings, NTSB or other investigative reports. Where primary documents are unavailable, we rely on major investigative reporting from outlets with established fact-checking processes. The New York Times, The Washington Post, Associated Press, BBC, ProPublica. For historical context and statistical interpretation, we reference academic or expert analysis published in reputable venues. Fringe claims that originate on message boards or partisan listicles will be treated as what they are, sources of memes, not evidence. Third, labeling, always. Every claim we discuss will be explicitly labeled as one of the following: verified fact, official determination, reported allegation, or unverified claim. When a claim is unverified, we trace its provenance as far as the public record allows. If this approach resonates with you and you want more evidence-first work like this, consider subscribing. It helps support careful reporting and sourcing. Case Study 1. Vincent Foster, the Washington Scene, and the Official Verdicts. The first case most people point to is Vince Foster. Picture Washington in the early 1990s, a city in the thick of transition, marble offices and late-night conversations, the new administration still finding itself. Foster, a lawyer who had been a longtime associate of Bill Clinton, took a position as deputy White House counsel in January 1993. To colleagues, he was described as intelligent, meticulous, and under substantial pressure. On a late summer morning, July 20, 1993, his body was found in Fort Marcy Park, Virginia, a short drive from the White House. What the public record shows is an extended, sometimes repetitive, and often politicized investigative trail. The initial law enforcement response, the U.S. Park Police, treated the death as suspicious until the forensic evidence was examined. Through the fall and into the following year, multiple investigations unfolded. The U.S. Park Police concluded their inquiry. The Fairfax County Medical Examiner issued a ruling, and later, the Office of Independent Counsel conducted a more formal review. The final official determinations, after extensive review of autopsy results, scene forensic analysis, and ancillary documents, concluded that Foster had died by suicide. The Independent Counsel's report and the medical examiner's ruling are part of the public record and have been cited repeatedly by major outlets such as The Washington Post and The New York Times. But the case did not settle in the public imagination. The combination of Foster's role in an administration under intense political scrutiny, the location of the death, and procedural missteps in the early months of the investigation created openings for alternate narratives. Critics pointed to the presence of documents in Foster's briefcase, to discrepancies in initial police statements, and to the handling of the scene. Supporters of conspiracy theories argued that the official findings ignored motive or suppressed evidence. In response, subsequent investigations and reviews published the forensic details they relied on: toxicology reports, wound analyses consistent with a self-inflicted gunshot, and scene reconstructions. The Independent Counsel addressed many of the alleged anomalies and found them either explained by the forensic record or by routine law enforcement practice. A detailed timeline bears this out. Foster was last seen on July 19, 1993, visiting his office and then leaving late in the day. The next morning his car was discovered in the park and his body was located by a passerby. The initial emergency response, medical examiner's examination, and forensic testing were completed in the weeks that followed. The park police completed their report, identifying the gunshot wound and reconstructing the circumstances. The Fairfax County Medical Examiner returned a cause of death consistent with suicide. The Independent Counsel's probing, which can be read in full in the publicly available report, reviewed all forensic material and interviewed multiple witnesses. It affirmed the conclusion that Foster had taken his own life. Why, then, did the story persist in conspiratorial form? Part of the answer lies in the power of unresolved emotional questions. Foster's deathscape, a familiar park close to the seat of power, combined with political enemies eager for suspicion, created fertile ground for alternative narratives. As the Washington Post and other outlets later explained in retellings, the forensic evidence remained the anchor for official findings. But the symbolic texture of the case, private anguish against the public glare, ensured it would not be simply archived. Case Study 2. Ron Brown, the plane in Croatia. Ron Brown, at the time the U.S. Secretary of Commerce, died on April 3, 1996, when the government plane he was on crashed on approach to a Croatian airport. Brown had been a prominent African-American political figure, a former Democratic National Committee chair, and a member of the Clinton administration. The crash killed Brown and several others on board. The accident was investigated by the relevant aviation authorities, including Croatian investigators and American agencies capable of offering assistance or analysis. Official accident reports and contemporaneous coverage in outlets such as the New York Times and the Associated Press documented the conditions surrounding the crash. Poor visibility reported at the airport, difficulties on approach, and the aircraft's behavior in the moments before impact. Official statements and reporting described the investigation's findings that focused on pilot decision-making and environmental conditions rather than foul play. The circumstances, however, provided material for suspicion: high-profile passenger, international travel, and incomplete public knowledge in the immediate aftermath. Some critics argued for further inquiry, citing alleged irregularities or the high stakes of Brown's political role. Journalistic follow-ups published in mainstream outlets reviewed the accident record and reporting. They found no substantiated evidence of sabotage or targeted violence. The official record, the aviation investigation reports and subsequent reporting, thus played a central role in shaping the public conclusion that the crash was a tragic accident. To understand why this case is included on the lists, consider the mechanics of rumor formation. A plane crash with a senior official on board is a highly salient event. It will attract scrutiny and demand explanation. In an era before immediate, transparent data release around crashes, gaps in public knowledge were easily filled by speculation. Over time, the speculation entrenched itself into list form: a death, a short note, a pointer toward conspiracy. But when investigators reconstructed the flight's final minutes, the data pointed to human and environmental factors, rather than intentional harm. Case Study 3. James McDougal. Illness in prison. James McDougal had been a central figure in the Whitewater investigations of the 1990s. A former Arkansas businessman and partner with Bill and Hillary Clinton in real estate ventures, McDougal became a subject of federal scrutiny, was convicted on various fraud-related charges, and was serving a sentence when he died on March 8, 1998. The public record surrounding McDougal's death is comparatively straightforward. He suffered a fatal heart attack while incarcerated. Reporting at the time, including coverage by the New York Times and Associated Press, documented his medical history, the conditions of his confinement, and the medical response. McDougal had known underlying cardiac disease, and his death was not ruled suspicious by authorities. Still, his death appears on the circulated lists and has been presented in some commentaries as evidence of a political pattern. Why do such cases gain traction? Two forces are at work. First, people directly involved in high-stakes political controversies are more likely than average to have stressful lives and, in some cases, health conditions exacerbated by stress. Second, when those deaths occur amid a larger narrative of scandal, they are woven into the scandal's symbolic quilt. McDougal's death, given his entanglement with the Clintons' political history and his public profile during a fraught national inquiry, became a data point in many retellings, even when the proximate medical cause was ordinary and documented. Case Study 4. Jeffrey Epstein, Association, Flights, and a Contested Death. Jeffrey Epstein does not appear on the earliest iterations of the body count lists, but he is central to modern iterations because of his connections with many powerful people, and because his own death in federal custody in 2019 produced a storm of suspicion. Epstein was a financier accused of sex trafficking. He had been arrested and charged in New York when he was found dead in his cell at the Metropolitan Correctional Center in August 2019. The New York City medical examiner ruled Epstein's death a suicide by hanging. At the same time, a cascade of procedural failures at the jail, documented in Inspector General reports and reporting by major outlets, meant that the institutional circumstances were deeply flawed. Cameras with gaps in footage, staff shortages, and lapses in required monitoring. What has propelled Epstein into the orbit of Clinton-related conspiracists is not only the manner of his death, but documented associations. Flight logs and other records, reported on by multiple mainstream outlets, indicate that Bill Clinton took several flights on Epstein's private jet in the early 2000s in connection with philanthropic activity and on staffed official business. Clinton's office and spokespeople have said he had a limited relationship with Epstein and disavowed close association. The presence of these flight logs and the timing of Epstein's arrest and death in federal custody created an image that, for some, implied deeper entanglement or motive. Yet the public record around Epstein's death, the medical examiner's ruling, the Department of Justice's reports on jail misconduct, and the extensive investigative reporting documenting Epstein's crimes, does not support a conclusion that associates, including former presidents, had a role in his death. The official findings attribute Epstein's death to self-inflicted injury, while the context of operational failures in the jail explains how the oversight cascade could lead to a tragic outcome. That combination, a high-profile prisoner, procedural missteps, and public fascination, is a potent engine for rumor. Tracing sources here shows the difference between association and culpability. The flight logs and visitor records are real documents and are properly cited by major newsrooms. But the jump from documented association to culpability in a death is not supported by the public document trail. Where allegations of direct involvement arise, they are typically sourced to anonymous posts or conjectural accounts, rather than to forensic or prosecutorial findings. For responsible inquiry, the distinction matters. Patterns, probability, and the anatomy of coincidence. A preview. At this juncture, it is tempting to draw a through line. Powerful people, contested politics, a handful of sudden or suspicious deaths. The human mind is primed to find pattern. Narrative loves closure. But raw intuition is not evidence. Two analytical tools are necessary before the question, coincidence or calculation, can be answered with any rigor. One is statistical framing. To understand whether a cluster of events is unusual, we must compare that cluster to baseline expectations. How many people connected to politics die each year of natural causes, accidents, or by suicide? What is the expected number of deaths in professions that involve travel, late hours, and frequent contact with volatile situations? Journalists and statisticians have pointed out that when you start with a large population, the net of people who interact with a presidency over decades, the likelihood of apparently unusual clusters grows. Clustering is a feature of random distributions. Once presented with a list that highlights certain outcomes, our brains see design where chance can suffice. The second tool is motive and logistics analysis. A claim that deaths were orchestrated requires not only motive, but the capacity to execute and conceal such actions over time. That introduces questions of changing personnel, the number of people who would need to be involved, documentary traces, legal risks, and the temporal spread across decades. Most credible investigations of political violence emphasize that conspiracies of scale are hard to maintain without leakage into documented channels. And in the cases where systematic foul play has been proven, it has been accompanied by incontrovertible forensic evidence and legal findings. Throughout the remainder of the investigation, we will bring in voices from both domains: forensic experts who can explain autopsy and scene findings, aviation investigators who describe the typical causal chain in crashes, criminal investigators who explain how patterns of suspicion form, and statisticians who can model how clusters emerge by chance. We will also trace the list's provenance. Where did the Clinton body count first appear in a concrete form that researchers can locate? How did it spread? From chain emails and radio shows to websites and social platforms. Which iterations add names without documentation, and which rest on verifiable public records? Before we move to that analysis, one more case that illustrates how association fuels rumor, a set of names sometimes invoked collectively but unevenly documented. Consider an example pattern that recurs in lists: aides, associates, or business figures who intersect with a political family over years and later die under ordinary or tragic circumstances. Each individual case often has an official explanation: a heart attack in custody, an accident while traveling, a suicide that investigators concluded resulted from personal circumstances. Yet when those cases are pulled together without context, the resulting collage suggests orchestration. A sober assessment requires patient, case-by-case work. That is what we have begun and continue to do. To follow the paper trail, to read the reports, to evaluate the gaps, and to note where the weight of evidence tips. So far in the cases we have detailed, the public records, police reports, medical examiner determinations, aviation accident reports, jail oversight documents, and mainstream investigative journalism, have provided clear official conclusions in which foul play is not supported by forensic or documentary evidence. That does not settle every public question. It only shows that the burden of proof for a claim of targeted violence remains unmet by the available files. The scene ahead is twofold. First, a statistical and contextual analysis that will model expected death rates among political circles and explain how randomness and selection bias can create shocking-looking patterns. Second, a media archaeology, tracing how the list formed, who amplified it at key moments, how each iteration added or removed names, and which outlets performed methodical debunking versus amplification. Along the way, we will bring in experts whose on-the-record comments and analyses help place the public record in context. Aviation investigators who have spoken to crash causes in similar circumstances, medical examiners who explain how cause of death determinations are reached, and journalists who have traced the online genealogy of viral lists. We will also identify the limits of public documents and highlight where further transparency would help settle lingering questions. But to understand the bigger pattern, we must keep returning to the human texture behind each name. A park bench where a colleague was last seen alive. A government plane crossing a foreign coastline. A hospital corridor where a sentence ends in sudden arrest. Those are not props for a narrative. They are the coordinates of grief. Responsible inquiry honors those coordinates while testing claims against the weight of evidence. Coming up, we will step back and put the cases into a broader statistical and media framework. How likely is it that an apparently clustered set of deaths is the product of chance? What logistic hurdles would a coordinated campaign face? How did the list migrate from early chain letters to today's social platforms? We will also introduce forensic voices. Readers will hear, in their words, how scene evidence and toxicology results point toward specific determinations, and statisticians will demonstrate, with accessible modeling, how clustering occurs in large populations. For now, we pause at the edge of the questions and the documents that answer them. The list persists because it satisfies a certain appetite for hidden connections. Our task is to examine the documents honestly, to separate verified facts from conjecture, and to respect the human costs of rumor. In the next stage of this investigation, we will weigh probability, motive, and the ecology of online belief against the forensic and archival record. And we will, in each case, show you the primary sources we relied upon so that you can draw your own informed conclusions. We now move from the paper trail of individual cases into two investigations that must run in parallel. The mathematics of coincidence and the history of how an internet meme becomes treated like evidence. To answer, coincidence or something more? We need both tools in hand. One measures how likely a cluster is to appear by chance. The other explains how a cluster, once noticed, spreads and hardens into a narrative. Neither alone settles the question. Together, they let us weigh plausibility. Statistical framing, how to think about clusters without being fooled. Imagine for a moment the presidency and its orbit as a large net. Over the course of decades, thousands of people pass through it. Campaign staff, fundraisers, donors, business partners, contractors, government appointees, lobbyists, journalists, and friends. Many of them travel frequently, work long hours, and, by virtue of proximity to power, face stresses not shared by the general population. Some hold high-risk jobs that involve travel, private planes, or dangerous work. When someone pulls a handful of names from that net and highlights the subset that died under unusual or sudden circumstances, the result can look striking. But striking is not the same as proof. To make this concrete without hiding behind abstract cautions, consider a simplified model. The U.S. crude death rate hovers in recent years at roughly 8 to 9 deaths per 1,000 people per year. For adults in middle age and older, the rate is higher. If over a 30-year span, 10,000 people are meaningfully connected to a presidential orbit, a conservative estimate if one counts staff rotations, contractors, business contacts, and media figures across multiple administrations, a rough expectation, using a baseline mortality rate of 8 per 1,000 per year, would predict on the order of 0.008 deaths per person per year, x 10,000 people, x 30 years, earn 2,400 deaths. Put plainly, thousands of deaths are statistically expected among anyone involved in a large social or professional network over decades. Within that group, some will be accidental deaths, some from natural causes, some suicides, some homicides. When you highlight only the non-routine, the shocking, the untimely, a plane crash, a high-profile suicide, a sudden death in custody, those select cases will be more memorable and more likely to be woven into a pattern-forming narrative. Probability amplifies the illusion. If 5 unusual deaths occur within a small subset of the network over a decade, the human brain asks for a cause. But mathematically, random processes generate clusters. Statisticians describe this as Poisson clustering, or the law of small numbers, rare events by chance sometimes clumped together. Journalists and statisticians have repeatedly warned that without a proper baseline, without asking how many such alliances exist and what would we expect by coincidence, anecdotal lists will mislead. There is another dimension beyond raw death counts: selection bias. The lists that circulate are not random samples. They are curated. The curator is seeking confirmation. That process selects for items that amplify the intended thesis, deaths linked by proximity or association to the family in question, while excluding the many neutral or ordinary outcomes that would dilute the impression of a pattern. Selection bias, combined with availability bias, we remember what is dramatic, creates a narrative that appears denser than the underlying reality. Finally, there is the problem of post hoc selection. Once a list exists, confirmation seeking will place any new, vaguely relevant death into the pattern, which then appears to grow over time. But this is not evidence of coordination, it is evidence of narrative accretion. To bring this home, none of this mathematical reasoning proves innocence or guilt in any single case. It only reframes how we should interpret a list compiled after the fact. If someone argues that a cluster of 10 deaths proves a conspiracy, the statistical burden is on them to define the universe of comparison, how many people were in the net, to show that the observed cluster is significantly beyond what chance would create, and to eliminate plausible non-conspiratorial mechanisms, something that has not been done in a fully documented way for the lists we examined. Motive, means, and the logistical hurdles of sustained coordination. If coincidence is one explanation, the other is an assertion of design. A credible claim of coordinated violence or targeted killings requires three elements: motive, means, and concealment, and all three must be sustained over time across a wide set of actors. Motive. Political opponents and internal critics have asked whether there were motives. In the cases we examined, motive claims tend to be circular. The deceased are alleged to have had knowledge or to have posed a threat to a political figure. Therefore, the political figure had motive to remove them. But motive needs specificity. Which specific knowledge, at what time, held by which person, would have justified taking extraordinary risks? Motive, left at the level of "they might know something," is not sufficient to explain multiple deaths across different contexts. Means. The logistics of a sustained campaign of targeted killings would necessarily involve operatives, infrastructure, and cross-jurisdictional coordination, each adding risk of exposure. Modern investigative standards tell us that conspiracies involving more than a handful of participants leak quickly. People talk, records accumulate, and discrepancies surface in routine bureaucratic processes. In the United States, where free press and multiple investigative bodies operate, a conspiratorial chain stretching decades with no credible whistleblower or corroborative forensic evidence would be a highly unlikely feat. That reality does not make individual well-supported allegations impossible. Rather, it raises the bar for extraordinary proof. Concealment. Concealment is harder still. Forensic science, digital records, travel logs, financial transactions, and independent investigations make long-term secrecy costly. Again, this is not to say concealment is impossible. It is to say that the existence of motive alone is not an adequate substitution for corroborating evidence. When we test the most prominent cases against these three elements, we find gaps. The official inquiries into Vincent Foster, the aviation investigations into Ron Brown's crash, medical records for James McDougal, and the DOJ and medical examiner findings around Jeffrey Epstein all provide concrete documentary trails. In none of these cases does the public record contain corroborated evidence of a coordinated campaign by or on behalf of the Clintons to kill associates. Where legitimate procedural failings existed, for example, the mismanagement at the Metropolitan Correctional Center in Epstein's case, they illuminate institutional failures and negligence rather than a clandestine assassination program directed from a political office. A closer look at media ecology, how the list formed and migrated. The Clinton body count did not spring fully formed from a single source. Its genealogy is typical of modern political memes. Fragments originated in partisan newsletters, late-night radio shows, and chain emails in the 1990s. Those fragments were recombined in talk radio and on political websites. Later, social media and fringe forums amplified and extended the list, adding names without independent verification. Fact-checking organizations have traced many of the list's iterations and found frequent embellishments. Snopes, for example, examined early versions and noted that many names were included on the basis of weak or non-existent links or on mischaracterized circumstances. Factcheck.org and other outlets have repeatedly pointed out that numerous entries on widely circulated lists lack corroborating documentation. A few mechanics bear emphasis because they shape how rumors ossify into evidence. Chain curation. Early lists were passed in chain emails with minimal sourcing. Those lists then became the template for later reposts. Once a name appears on a widely shared list, its presence is treated as de facto confirmation and copied forward without rechecking. Confirmation loops. When partisan media amplify a list, their audiences interpret amplification as validation. If a talk radio host reads a list aloud, listeners may assume the host vetted it. In reality, hosts often read material supplied by producers or callers. Mutation and accretion. As the list circulates, new names are added and old names are recontextualized. Each new iteration claims a richer evidence base, but the additions are rarely scrutinized to the same standard as primary sources. Visual authority. Screenshots of lists, document-style images, or compiled timelines give the appearance of archival research even when no new records are presented. Visual formats obscure provenance. They make readers less likely to ask, "Where did this come from?" Social incentives. People who share a narrative that fits their prior beliefs get social reinforcement. That incentive accelerates spread and reduces skepticism within like-minded communities. High-quality newsrooms have performed genealogies of the list. For instance, long-form investigative pieces in major newspapers traced how various names migrated into the list and then assessed those names against official records. The consistent finding: many entries are either misattributions, conflations, or refer to cases with ordinary, documented causes of death. That does not prove that every case is unproblematic. It shows that the list's construction process is porous and often unmethodical. Expert voices on coincidence and investigation. To ensure balance, we spoke with, and relied on published interviews with, experts in 3 domains: statistics, forensic pathology, and investigative journalism. On probability, a statistician interviewed in reporting by major news outlets explained how large populations produce improbable-seeming clusters. His point, echoed across academic literature, is straightforward. Humans are pattern-seeking animals. Large datasets will always contain surprising clusters. The relevant analytic task is distinguishing surprising from statistically improbable once you correct for multiple comparisons and selection bias. On forensic interpretation, medical examiners and forensic pathologists, as quoted in investigative reporting, stress that determinations of cause and manner of death rest on multiple data points: scene investigation, autopsy findings, toxicology, witness statements, and circumstantial evidence. In cases like Foster's, the full autopsy and subsequent independent reviews are what led officials to classify the death as suicide. Medical examiners caution against second-guessing autopsy conclusions without access to the full records and professional expertise. On investigative standards, veteran investigative journalists who have rechecked claims about the list emphasize procedural best practices. Find primary documents first. Verify chain of custody for records. Talk to coroners and investigators on the record, and avoid relying on anonymous or second-hand internet posts. Where journalists have found genuine anomalies in official accounts, they have pursued those anomalies rigorously, publishing follow-ups, FOIA requests, and recommendation for re-examination. Where anomalies were explained by forensic evidence or procedural detail, those explanations were published as well. Together, these expert perspectives point to a methodology. Rely on primary documents where available, interpret them by consulting domain experts, and refrain from running with hypotheses that cannot be tested against the available records. Case Study Addendum: the mechanics of document tracing and the dangers of incomplete records. Some skeptics will point out that official records can be incomplete, that corruption exists, and that powerful people have means to hide wrongdoing. Those are valid points in the abstract. History contains true scandals where powerful actors concealed criminality. But the work of distinguishing legitimate cover-ups from rumor requires meticulous document tracing. In several of the cases in our set, and in other names that frequently crop up on the list, the public documents are substantial. The Foster inquest produced an independent counsel's report. Ron Brown's crash generated aviation investigation reports and reporting on cockpit conditions. McDougal's death was recorded with prison medical documentation. Epstein's death produced an autopsy and an Inspector General's report on the correctional facility's failures. These records do different things. Some are conclusive, others leave unanswered questions. Our responsibility as investigators is to state which is which. There remain legitimately areas where records are thin. Early chain emails and talk radio claims sometimes refer to named associates for whom no public official record of connection exists. In those cases, we mark indefinido and exclude the name from our core case studies. The old maxim applies: absence of a smoking gun is not proof of innocence, but neither is absence of evidence grounds for making an allegation. Epstein Revisited: association versus causation. Jeffrey Epstein's case deserves a particular paragraph because it sits at the intersection of two dynamics we have described: plausible association and genuine institutional failure. Epstein associated with many wealthy and powerful people. Flight logs and visitor records document that association. His death in federal custody was ruled a suicide by the New York City medical examiner, but the circumstances at the jail, staffing lapses, camera gaps, and neglect are well documented in Inspector General reports and investigative reporting. That combination, strong associative ties plus institutional failure, is precisely the tinder that makes conspiracy narratives flourish. What does the record support? It supports documentation of Epstein's connections, reporting on the scope of his criminal behavior, and evidence of institutional malpractice at the jail. What the record does not support, in publicly available documents, is credible forensic evidence linking specific external actors to his death. Assertions that such actors ordered or arranged for Epstein's death rely on insinuation rather than on documents. That is a crucial distinction. The first is demonstrable, the second remains speculative. Counterarguments. What do the strongest claims for conspiracy look like, and how do they fare? To be fair, we reviewed the strongest, best-sourced arguments put forward by those who believe the list indicates targeted action. Their case generally proceeds along several lines: pattern, multiple deaths of individuals connected to a political family over time. Motive, several of the deceased were perceived threats, carried damaging documents, or were witnesses in investigations. Anomalies, discrepancies in official accounts, procedural mistakes, or unusual circumstances around a death. Institutional opacity, lack of transparency in certain investigations, sealed records, or inconsistent releases. We examined each of those elements against primary records. The result is mixed, but instructive. Pattern. As already discussed, pattern in and of itself is not dispositive. Without a clear, defined comparison universe and a demonstration of statistical deviation, pattern claims are suggestive at best. Motive. Many of the cases cited as motive-based rest on inferences about what a person could have known, not on documented proof that they intended to reveal fatal information. Motive is a necessary but insufficient condition for criminal action. Proof requires connecting motive to act. Anomalies. Some anomalies are real. The handling of Epstein's detention, documented lapses by jail staff, the failure of cameras at critical moments. These are not merely anomalies but failures that deserve scrutiny, and in some cases, accountability. But anomaly can mean many things. a failing in administrative process, incompetence, or malfeasance. Each requires a distinct investigatory response. An anomaly does not prove conspiracy. It proves an area requiring corrective attention. Institutional opacity, where records are sealed, where FOIA requests are stalled, or where information is redacted, the absence of transparency feeds suspicion. That is a legitimate democratic concern. Investigative journalism and oversight mechanisms exist precisely to pry open those sealed spaces. Where such efforts have occurred, they have occasionally produced new facts. More often they have shown that the anomalies had mundane explanations. In some, the strongest claims point to areas that merit further independent scrutiny. And those areas should be pursued by journalists, watchdogs, and where warranted, legal authorities. But the strongest claims do not amount to a comprehensive, documented case of coordinated action. There are gaps between suspicion and proof that remain. The human cost, rumor, grief, and responsibility. Beyond the technicalities of probability and the genealogy of lists, there is an ethical dimension that must not be sidelined. Every item on the list is a human life. Many are followed by grieving families. Public rumor, particularly when amplified by powerful platforms, has consequences. Reputational damage, harassment of family members, and the distortion of public discourse away from verifiable facts. Responsible reporting recognizes this cost. It requires careful labeling of allegations, citation of primary sources, and restraint in language. It also requires an openness to follow-up. Where anomalies remain, journalists must use the tools of their profession, FOIA, court filings, interviewing officials on the record, to either substantiate or debunk claims. Where wrongdoing is suspected, institutions must be pressured to release records or allow independent review. What would constitute convincing public evidence of targeted wrongdoing? It is worth outlining what would change the balance of plausibility. For a claim of targeted killings to be persuasive in a court of public opinion, and more importantly, for law enforcement to pursue it credibly, we would expect, at minimum, corroborated, contemporaneous documents indicating a plan or directive. This could include orders, financial transactions linked to operatives, communications discussing illicit activity, or other documentary proof tying decision-makers to operative action. Forensic evidence connecting external actors to violent acts. This might be ballistic evidence, DNA, travel logs that place operatives at alleged crime scenes, or other physical traces that can be independently verified. Credible witness testimony from participants with verifiable corroboration, not solely from anonymous online accounts. Witness testimony is powerful when supported by documents, independent confirmation, or physical evidence. A chain of independently verifiable investigative outcomes from competent authorities that show an actionable case. Convictions, indictments, or formal investigative findings from trusted institutions would be definitive. To date, the public record for the cases we examined does not contain the combination of these elements in any single convincing package, tying the deaths directly to a political family's orchestration. That does not mean investigators or journalists should stop probing. It does mean that, under standards of evidence, the assertion of a sustained campaign of targeted killings has not been demonstrated. Practical takeaways and next steps for serious inquiry. For viewers who want to move from rumor to credible investigation, here are clear practical steps consistent with journalistic and legal norms. Prioritize primary documents. Seek police reports, autopsy results, aviation accident reports, Inspector General reports, and court filings. These are the bedrock of credible claims. Avoid anonymous internet lists as primary evidence. Treat them as leads only when they point to documents that can be independently verified. Use FOIA and legal tools. When records are sealed or withheld, pursue lawful mechanisms to request disclosure. Watchdog organizations and investigative newsrooms have protocols for this. Consult domain experts early. Forensic pathologists, aviation investigators, and statisticians can show whether a particular piece of evidence is meaningful or misleading. Label carefully. In public-facing work, every claim must be labeled as alleged, confirmed, ruled accidental, or unverified. Prioritize family dignity. When reporting on deaths, contact relatives in a compassionate, respectful way and avoid amplifying speculation that can cause further harm. Conclusion: weighing the evidence and the open questions. Where does this leave us with the question at the heart of our title? The Clinton body count. Coincidence or something more? The evidence we reviewed, primary documents, official determinations, aviation reports, medical examiner findings, inspector general reports, and major news investigations, suggests the following balanced conclusions. First, many of the individual cases that appear on circulating lists are documented in public records with determinations that do not support a finding of homicide or targeted killing. Vincent Foster's death, for example, was investigated multiple times and ruled a suicide by the relevant authorities based on forensic evidence available to them. Ron Brown's death was the result of an aviation accident examined by investigators who cited environmental and operational factors. James McDougal died of a heart attack while incarcerated. Jeffrey Epstein's death was ruled a suicide by the New York City medical examiner, even as institutional failures at the correctional facility created legitimate grounds for oversight and reform. Second, the pattern of deaths, when evaluated against population baselines and the statistical realities of large social networks, is not by itself persuasive proof of concerted wrongdoing. Clusters occur in random processes. Selection bias and confirmation bias amplify their apparent significance. Third, there are valid places for further inquiry. Epstein's detention failures deserve accountability. Any credible new evidence linking other cases to criminal wrongdoing should be pursued by independent investigative bodies. Public institutions must be transparent where possible, and investigative journalists must continue to press for records and clear reporting. Finally, even as we note openings for further investigation, we must insist on standards. Allegations must be substantiated by documents, corroborated testimony, or forensic evidence. They should not be advanced based on internet lists, hearsay, or political motive alone. Responsible inquiry protects both the integrity of the investigation and the dignity of the individuals involved. An ethical closing. What viewers can do. If you have read this far, you are likely someone who values digging past headlines and asking for evidence. Here is how you can help ensure public discourse remains anchored to facts. If you encounter a list or a claim, ask for the primary sources before sharing. Where can the police report, coroner's report, or official filing be found? When a claim is based on an anonymous post or a chain email, treat it as unverified until independent reporting confirms it. Support reputable investigative journalism. Deep reporting, FOIA work, long-form document analysis, interviews with experts, is resource-intensive. If you have access to documents not yet public and believe they shed light on one of these cases, share them with a reputable investigative newsroom or an independent watchdog that can authenticate and responsibly report on them. In public conversations, favor precise language: alleged, reported, ruled, unverified. Precision matters for justice and for human dignity. Final note and call to action. This investigation has tried to do two things at once: honor the human stories embedded in the names that circulate online, and hold those stories up to the standard of evidence. The result is mixed. Some official records are thorough and make firm determinations. Others leave questions. Still others have been distorted by the mimetic machinery of the internet. When the machinery of rumor meets the weight of grief, it creates a toxic blend that can mislead entire conversations about truth and power. If you have documents, credible sources, or questions about any case we covered, leave them in the comments below. We will review submissions and, where appropriate, pursue requested FOIA requests or follow-up reporting. The description below contains an annotated bibliography listing the primary documents, major investigative articles, aviation reports, medical examiner findings, and fact-checking posts we used to assemble this examination. Check those links, read the original records where possible, and draw your conclusions on the basis of verifiable evidence. Our civic life depends on distinguishing the plausible from the provable. Rumor corrodes. Evidence illuminates. Thank you for examining the record with us.